On your evening roundup show on Connect FM 91.5 with me, Yasmin Gandham. We know the issue of the U.S.-Canada border following the COVID-19 pandemic has been a big topic of discussion, and this week the federal government announced that they will be allowing for family reunification. We are speaking with Keith Baldrey. He is Global BC's Legislative Bureau Chief since 1995, and he's made numerous public appearances to discuss BC politics, and is always the go-to on Global BC for discussing the issues with the border, and he is on the phone with us right now. Good evening, Keith. How are you?
Oh, great to be here. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. And I want to talk to you. We know that there has been a serious resurgence of COVID-19 cases in numerous states across the U.S. So what does this mean for the border closure?
Well, I think it's almost inevitable. The border is going to be closed probably for the entire summer. I think the fall is the next window. It may open because, as you mentioned, there is a resurgence of COVID-19 numbers in a number of American states. Places where it hadn't been that serious at the beginning of the pandemic are now skyrocketing. Texas, Florida, California, Oregon. Now, just today, the governor announced they're going to have to stop opening up and easing restrictions because COVID is just skyrocketing. Washington State is actually not as bad as many other states. I track Washington State every day. Mm-hmm. Today, 392 more cases were reported in just one day. You compare that to BC's 14 today. Mm-hmm. You've got 10 deaths in Washington State today. We had one in BC. In the past 6 days, we've had one death in British Columbia. I think we're now tracking upwards of 60 or 70 deaths in Washington State. And again, the virus is starting to travel in places it wasn't traveling before. And that makes it very problematic when you start looking at border states of opening up that border. And it's partly Americans coming across the border from areas where COVID-19 is very prevalent, but also Canadians going south of the border to visit the United States and then potentially bringing the virus back over the border back into British Columbia or whatever province we're talking about. So it was interesting. Chrystia Freeland, the minister responsible this week, responding to a Reuters agency report saying that the border is going to remain closed until at least the end of July, did not dispute it and says what right now our arrangement with the United States is working just fine. The land border is closed except for essential service, and that basically means commercial truck trade. We still need to move goods back and forth across the border, and that does risk the exposure of COVID coming in. Truck drivers could potentially have this virus, but there has to be some allowance made for the economy to breathe and to function. So I expect, judging from Chrystia Freeland's comments and what we're hearing from Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York and such, the border likely will remain shut to all but essential service through the summer. I think the fall is the next time we're looking at opening.
And you mentioned that Canadians traveling to the U.S. could potentially bring the virus back home. And many Canadians are unaware that even though they are currently barred from driving to the U.S., they can still fly to the country and likely not be subject to a 14-day quarantine. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's a lot of... I don't want to call it ignorance, but there's just a lot of unknowns about this. Yes, I'm just looking at YVR's. I go to YVR's departure and arrival site every day, and every day there are flights from Seattle arriving and departing for Seattle. Presumably, a lot of Canadians are coming home, but a lot of people are deciding to travel for business purposes. There's international travel. There's a flight arriving from Hong Kong today. There was a flight from China yesterday. There's flights to Los Angeles routinely. It depends on where you go, whether or not you face a 14-day isolation. Some countries have very rigid protocols in place, and some states do, but some states are more lax. And you don't have the vigorous public health measures and requirements you do, say, in British Columbia and parts of Canada, as you do, say, down in some of the American states, particularly in the South, where it's not seen as serious. So the other risk you run, and I've just picked up on this, is you can travel internationally right now. You can go to the States, but you also run the risk you might not get travel insurance. Travel insurers right now are balking at not all of them, but many are, balking and insuring you just in case you get COVID-19. If you get put on a ventilator in a foreign country, that will bankrupt you if you don't have travel insurance, and it's increasingly difficult to get that travel insurance. So international travel has shrunk to almost nothing, but it hasn't disappeared completely. It's The airports are different than the land borders.
Right. And this new policy that has come into effect this week allowing for family reunification, what does this mean? Do you think we will see an increase in cases here in Canada?
Well, one of the estimates I saw was that we're talking probably 1,500 people might take advantage of this meeting up at the border and crossing. If Americans come and meet their Canadian families, and this is defined as your spouse or your common law partner or a dependent child, and guardian or tutor, for example, if you cross from the States into Canada, you've got to go into self-isolation for 14 days. So it's the same as arriving at YVR. So that's not really a concern. And again, it depends what state you're going into. If you're Canadian going down south to meet up with your loved one, you may have to go into 14-day isolation or you may not, depending on what state you're going into. But bear in mind, right now, any Canadian thinking of going across the border into visit an American state is taking on an inherent risk, given the COVID-19 situation. I mean, the fact that BC and Washington are right next door to each other, yet the statistics are so startlingly different and stark compared to between our jurisdictions just shows you what a bit of a risk you're taking if you were to travel out in British Columbia, for example, what is arguably one of the safest places in all of North America, if not the world right now. BC is doing very well.
And you mentioned that one of the guidelines is a mandatory 14-day quarantine, but how will this be monitored? Because most people are coming to see family, so how will the government ensure that people are not staying with their loved ones and are self-isolating?
Well, we get an update right now of everybody who arrives at YVR. Has to present a isolation plan. It has to be signed off by the authorities. And there's now, I think, as of last week, there was about 44,000 people who were in self-isolation. About 1,500 of those people were in hotels around YVR because they couldn't have a place they couldn't show they had a place to go. And there was something like 35,000 phone calls, follow-up phone calls, and visits made to people who were supposed to be self-isolating. These are done by BC civil servants who've been seconded into these jobs, which is to ensure that they are self-isolating. And you can face some fairly stiff penalties, and talking hundreds of thousands of dollars of fines if you're found in violation of the Federal Quarantine Act. So you are checked, and we've heard of instances. I'm not sure the police are involved in British Columbia. It is involved in other jurisdictions where the police will literally phone you and say, come to the window and show us that you're home. And that's the checking that's going on. It's quite extraordinary, and there's no incidents yet that we've heard of someone who's supposed to be in self-isolation breaking the rules. I'm sure, probably somebody is, but the fact we haven't seen COVID-19 numbers spike in British Columbia to any large degree for more than a month now. And more importantly, the hospitalization rates are going down. That tells me that the virus is not that prevalent in BC. And even if people are probably skirting the rules or breaking the rules of self-isolating, it doesn't seem to have an impact on the spread of the virus.
And other than this 14-day quarantine, are there any other details on guidelines that are set out for family reunification?
Well, they're supposed to be still maintaining their social distance, but again, if it's a family, that's the people who hug each other. And if you go into self-isolation, one assumes if a spouse is crossing the border to be with their spouse, they're going to be living together, and they're going to be staying together for those 14 days. And if you're in self-isolation with each other, the rules apply for both of you. You don't leave. You find someone to make sure you've got provisions and such. Or they may be in a situation where one spouse lives in the basement, one lives upstairs, and one's free to move. I think the rules may vary from literally situation to situation. But again, because the numbers are so small with this family reunification, I don't think that's going to have a huge impact.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Keith, for sharing your insights and providing our listeners with answers to a lot of questions that they perhaps haven't gotten the answer to. So I really appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity to give that information out. Call me anytime.
Thank you so much, Keith. Take care.
All right, bye.